Welcome to the next episode of Navigating Carbon, your compass to carbon management. As always, I'm your host, Deb Ryan, and in this episode, I sat down with Dawn Lima. Dawn is the VP of Renewable Energy and Sustainable Technology at FOSS and Company. FOSS is a nationally recognised institutional investment fund sponsor with a focus on projects that generate federal tax credits. Dawn and I talk about how companies use tax credits and what they represent before diving in to understand the nuances of some of the energy and sustainable credits that are currently available to project developers. Dawn goes into depth on the four main credits impacting energy, including 45Q for carbon capture, 45V for hydrogen development, 45Y for clean energy development from sources like geothermal and nuclear, and finally a discussion on 45Z, the fuels credit. Dawn also discusses some of the broader market impacts that are driving demand for each of these credits and what she's looking out for in this dynamic landscape. To stay on top of all upcoming episodes, please make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. But for now, sit back and enjoy my conversation with Dawn. Hey everyone, and welcome to the next episode of the Navigating Carbon podcast. Today I'm joined by Dawn Lima. Dawn, how are you?
I'm great. How are you, Deb?
Good. It's good to have you on today. We've known each other actually quite a while, but we caught up an event recently, and you're working in a really interesting, fun space around sort of sustainability and renewable tax credits. And I thought it's a conversation we haven't had on the podcast, and I'm really curious to pick your brain and for everybody to be able to learn about kind of what you're doing. So yeah, really excited to catch up and jump in. So as we get started, you work for a company called FOSS. For those that aren't familiar, give us just a little bit of background around what the company does and what you guys are up to.
Yeah, be happy to. And thanks very much for inviting me. It's always exciting to connect. And I really do try to make the topic of tax credits exciting. So hopefully that's the case today as well. But yeah, so Foss and Company, the firm that I work for, we have been in the tax credit space since 1983. So 43 or 42 years of experience. Always tax credit specialists. And we are really an investment firm. So corporations set up funds with Boss, and we offer them a boutique white glove service to help them source projects that will generate tax credits. And those projects are go through our funds. We do all the underwriting on their behalf. We do the asset management or portfolio management during the term of the investment, and then we help them exit. So tax credit investors, the US government have used tax credits as a way to incentivize investment for a long time, for over 4 decades. So this is not a new program because of energy transition. It's been around for a long time. And it's a very successful social engineering tool to spur investment into the areas that are important to the government, to our nation. And so FOSS has been active in the space for over 40 years. So we've done 9 billion of transactions, and we've never had a recapture event on behalf of one of our investors for any project that we've been involved with. We have a great track record, and we're well known in this space. So happy to speak about renewable energy credits.
Yeah, no, there's because I think this is where, with a lot of the people that both you and I know, right? It feels like it's quite new because of some of the ones that I know, the tax credits that we're going to talk about specifically related to energy development more broadly. So it's like, can you explain for folks? So you sort of started to touch on that a little bit, but the idea of investing in projects that generate tax credits and what does that even mean for folks? Like when we're talking about tax credits, yeah, can you kind of give people a little bit of background about what are we even dealing with? What does that mean? Yeah.
And when I didn't even know about the tax credit industry until I started with FOSS 4 years ago. And I was very surprised because I feel like I'm a well-read person, and yet this industry was new to me. And it's been around a long time. It's been about a $20 billion industry for 4 decades. And it's very interesting that this is offered, but companies in the US can offset up to 75% of their tax liability, their federal tax liability, with tax credits. So banks, insurance companies, C Corps have been very active in the tax credit industry for a long time. And so if their, let's say their federal tax bill was 100 million, then they could purchase and find 75 million of tax credits from viable projects generating those credits. And instead of paying 75 million, write the big check. I always think of the Happy Gilmore big check, write the
Sure.
$75 million check that just goes into a general slush fund. They are basically directing those dollars to projects that really need the support of tax credit investors, and they convert the 75 million into tax credit. Think of them as certificates. And so instead of sending the 75 million to the IRS, they show that they have sent the 75 million to a project, and they then send the 75 million of certificates to the IRS.
That's cool. Yeah, and like you said, it really helps then incentivize technology development and like investment in, new things and stuff to get them to scale essentially.
Yeah.
So which
Yeah,
is
it's areas, so the longer industry is the so we have two divisions in FOSS: real estate and renewable energy. And our real estate division does historical building renovation projects and low income housing. And those projects generate both federal credits and state tax credits. And so, these are very high impact projects, very high social community impact. So you have an old building, and this a developer will come in and, maybe create retail space on the bottom, new housing on the top, and maintains the historical aspects of the building, but it breathes new life into the building, the community, the economy. So very high economic impact, high social impact. And so that developer really needs the dollars, the capital that comes in from the tax credit investors. So it's win-win on both sides. It supports the project developers, and more projects can be stood up because of those tax credit investors. And the tax credit investor, instead of paying a bill, if a lot of the tax credit investments generate, over 15% return. So instead of paying your bill and paying 100 million to the IRS, you're going to change the $100 million liability into an investment that's going to bring in 115 million at the end of the term, which is typically 5 years.
yeah. Very cool. Yeah. So let's pivot and talk a little bit because you head up the renewable energy and sustainability. You're VP of that at FOSS. So thinking about some of the energy credits, like we hear a lot about 45Q, which is the carbon capture credits, 45V, which is hydrogen. A new one that you pointed out for me that I hadn't heard of was the 45Y, looking at geothermal energy. And then there's also 45Z or Z. I was at the bank today and I said Z and they actually wanted to spell it out, but no, it's just because I'm Australian. So 45Z on the renewable fuels side. So there's all these different federal tax credits in the energy space. I don't know where you want to dive in because I assume they've all got sort of different kind of rules around them and stuff like that. I don't know if you want to start with the 45Q, talking about CCUS. I know that's one that gets a lot of attention from the oil and gas space in particular. What does that credit do? What is it for? And let's start there.
Sure, yeah. And 45Q was actually introduced quite a number of years ago. It's been around for a long time. But what happened in 22, when the Inflation Reduction Act passed in August of 22, the 45Q credit was increased. So the projects that we see a lot of happening in the US are the geological sequestration projects. And with your background in oil and gas like mine, there's a lot of overlap in terms of skill sets from the oil and gas community, and to the skills required to stand up a carbon capture project that does geological sequestration. So very simply, the 45Q credit is available for every ton of CO2 that is permanently sequestered. And so the purpose is to reduce emissions, extract CO2 from the atmosphere. So a removal project we hear a lot about is the DAC, so the direct air capture, right? It's the fan that
Yep.
is circulating in the air, absorbs the CO2 from the air, and then sequesters it. So the CO2 has to be permanently sequestered, and I sort of smile because I get asked sometimes from the beverage industry, right? If we're
Mhm.
using CO2 in soda, does that qualify then for 45Q credit? And the answer is no, because it's not permanently sequestered.
Yeah.
So geological sequestration, we're seeing a lot of those projects stood up in the US because of 45Q credit. So the tax credits are very important offsets. These are typically projects that require a lot of upfront capital. And because they're newer in the project finance space, they're deemed to be a little bit more risky. So it's hard for developers to secure the capital needed to stand up the projects. And the generation of the tax credits is meant to offset some of that cost. And because these are often FOEC, so first of a kind,
Mm.
in the case of carbon capture, it's not first of a kind, but you have to think from the project finance community side, they see them as higher risk because they're less familiar with the projects.
Yeah. And I think the permanent piece that you mentioned there is really important, right? Because again, the oil and gas industry has been sequestering CO2 through enhanced oil recovery for a long time. But again, that's not permanent. So it's like the idea of like how is, that making sure that it's permanently removing that CO2 as we look at emission reduction is really important, I think, from what you were talking about. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you said it's for 1 metric ton of CO2, it's like $85 credit. Is that correct?
85, yeah, for
Yeah.
geological sequestration. So it's
Okay.
actually CCUS, so it's carbon capture utilization sequestration. So the credit's available for enhanced oil recovery as
Oh, it
well.
is. Okay.
Yeah, so that's the utilization piece.
Okay.
So back in 22, when the Inflation Reduction Act passed, it was $60 a ton for utilization. EOR
Yep.
was the only process named, and then it was 85 a ton for geological sequestration. So what happened with OB3? So the one big beautiful bill we call OB3, it it actually was very supportive of the 45Q credit. It expanded utilization up to $85 and no change to the timeline of the availability of the 45Q credit.
Hmm.
And so it also, so since 22 to now in 25, there's been a tremendous amount of work in the industrial space looking at different ways to permanently sequester CO2 down the utilization pathway versus just geological sequestration. So we have a ton of innovation happening where companies are working on sequestering CO2 in concrete and steel.
Yeah.
And then, but to get the credit, you have to, so for EOR, it's the amount of CO2 that remains in the reservoir, and the IRS and the DOE have mapped out a mass balance process of how you calculate what is actually being just recycled in the reservoir, and that's how you claim the credit. And so now with OB3, the utilization is increased to 85, and there's more acceptance of other utilization applications that can pursue monetizing the credit. So there's actually a lot of great things happening in the CCUS space, and there's a tremendous amount of support post OB3 for access to capital and tax credits for those projects.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I think it's really awesome that you point out the industrial space as well, because I've spoken to some like methanol producers and some of the other like chemicals industry and stuff who've really been able to take advantage of the 45Q credit. Because so it's not, I think it's useful for people to know it's not just oil and gas that's sort of looking at this. It's a whole bunch of different applications, which is really, I think, like you said, it drives a lot of innovation, which I think is really fun and interesting and things like that.
Yeah, the tax. So the post the IRA with the 45Q credit being enhanced, it really did generate a lot of interest and a lot of additional activity, a lot of growth in the
Mhm.
carbon capture space in the US. And you can track it back 100% to the tax credit, that incentive. You know, the government wants the tax credits to incentivize investment. And if you just use CCUS as a case study, it is 100% correct that we saw a lot more activity in projects to capture CO2 to monetize that credit.
Yeah. Very cool. So let's switch now. I'm curious about the 45V on the hydrogen side. It's something in a past role, I heard a lot about it. There was a lot of excitement about the 45V credit when it first came out through the I think it was first named in the Inflation Reduction Act, but correct me
It
if I'm
was,
wrong.
yeah. Yeah.
And then there's been a lot of kind of like rework around how people can actually claim that credit and how it's being done and things like that. So just give us a little bit of an overview, because the hydrogen industry it's very nascent and there's a lot of questions. I think I always have a lot of questions about how it's going to scale and some of that kind of stuff. But yeah, curious as to your take on the hydrogen piece. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we haven't done a lot. Haven't had a lot of activity in the 45V space. You are 100% right. It was introduced with the Inflation Reduction Act in 22, and there was certainly a lot of excitement around the possibility of monetizing the credit, building projects that would generate green hydrogen. So I did an article on hydrogen last year because of all the interest in the 45E credit. And I'm trying to remember, I think there's over 10 colors of hydrogen, surprisingly. So
I hate the hydrogen rainbow. I'm just going to put that out.
yeah,
I hate it. It drives me crazy. Anyway.
I had no idea there were so many colors of hydrogen, but I called it 50 Shades of Gray, Understanding 45B.
So, and we can link that for folks. If you've got a link to that, we can put it in the show notes as well. But it's just, yeah, it felt like there was a new color being added almost every week of like, and I don't know. I think we need to use carbon intensity as a metric. And I think they went back. I think the DOE and the others have gone back to use a carbon intensity metric now for hydrogen because the colors got a little bit out of control. Like,
Yeah,
sort of didn't
there's
mean.
so many colors. Yeah. Well, but what the challenge with the 45V credit is that it was introduced in 22 with the IRA. Then we waited for a long time to get guidance. And there's a lot of debate about the source of the hydrogen, right? Is it coming from oil and gas, methane, so CH4 from oil and gas operations, the use of the water. So with using water to get to the hydrogen, and then just the case of excessive water usage,
Hmm.
the power required to generate green hydrogen it's a tremendous amount of power. And then is that power renewable energy? Is it renewable energy or is it traditional energy? And so we were waiting on guidance. And I think one of the biggest challenges is that in the US, we don't have a hydrogen market. So we have a small, hydrogen has never been a big market here. And so there wasn't a lot of offtake for hydrogen, green, gray, or any of the other colors. So it's hard to have projects being stood up without clear customers for your product. And that was a lot of the challenges that the early green hydrogen developers were running into, is who's going to buy the product. And to find project finance, to stand up a project, you really need to know who your customers are going to be. So then we saw the industry. So we don't have a hydrogen infrastructure. And then, what we saw with the carbon capture and the CO2, so the CCUS market, when developers tried to add pipelines to move CO2 around, there was a lot of pushback from the public about adding more pipelines to move CO2 around. And so then when you cross over to the hydrogen space, how are we going to add all these pipelines that are now moving hydrogen around, right? And all the safety risk, public acceptance, right? So then the industry started looking at distributed hydrogen, but then you go back to the issue of there isn't enough offtake.
Yeah.
So there was always a lot of headwinds with green hydrogen. And now, unfortunately, with OB3, it did not receive the support that some of the other credits did. So we're seeing a lot of developers refocus and really put a lot of the green hydrogen projects on pause,
Hmm.
and pivot. So oil and gas companies were doing some green hydrogen development, and they're pivoting now to relooking at geothermal, for example.
So let's pivot and talk about the geothermal because I wasn't aware of the 45Y geothermal credit and stuff like that as well. So um explain for folks what that one is and how that kind of works because the conversation around energy generally is such a huge just conversation in the general energy development right now. So
So 2025 has been a very dynamic year in the tax credit space. So when in my previous life, I was in oil and gas. And I felt that sometimes, there it wasn't as much of a dynamic space or intellectually stimulating anymore after 23 years. I felt like I was doing the same things sometimes. Well, I have not been able to say that in the tax credit space because every year just continues to deliver on a dynamic environment. So
Which is awesome.
2020,
That's great.
2025 has been the same. And so we were expecting a big change. And so 45Y is part of the tech neutral credits that were introduced. So the IRA, we knew with the IRA that as of 1/1/25, the credits would go from a family called Section 48 credits to tech neutral credits. And so any project that starts construction after 1/1/25, it's either a 48E credit or 48 or 45Y credit. So the ITC's investment tax credits are called 48E,
Okay.
and then the production tax credits are called 45Y.
Okay.
So we knew that change was coming, and so what happened with the 45Y tax credit family is there was certain underlying technologies that were called out. So hydro, geothermal, nuclear were called out as and other technologies. So solar, wind, geothermal, nuclear, hydro, and then waste to energy. So
Okay.
those are the underlying types of technologies that can qualify for the tech neutral 45Y production tax credit. And those projects need to be generating electricity. So if you have a geothermal project and the power that you're generating is used for electricity, then that project will qualify and generate 45Y tax credits. And it's calculated based on the amount of energy that the project is producing.
Very cool.
So that's why it's called a production tax credit. It's
Yeah.
a percentage of the production.
And so, and just so that folks know, because you did send me some stuff beforehand, which was very helpful, and I was reading it and stuff. So the difference between those is a IPT or IPC credits, which is the investment piece, versus the ongoing production. So, if I understand it correctly, then so for companies, say a geothermal company, then producing electricity on an monthly and an annual basis, like they can claim those credits then every year, right? As long as the credits still exist and are eligible to be claimed versus like a one-time claim against an investment. Is that correct in
Yeah.
understanding of that for folks?
Yeah, there's two types of tax
Mm.
credits in the renewable energy space. It's either an investment tax credit or an ITC, which is easiest to think of as a percentage of the capex. And so it's the benefits are in year one, and it's based on the capital required to stand up the project versus the other family is a production tax credit or PTC, and that is over a 10-year time frame, and it's a percentage of the production of energy each year.
Yeah. And it makes sense, the conversation, and I've seen it really dramatically over the course of this year where the conversation around just energy development in the US is kind of off the charts right now because of the AI demand and the conversations about where all of this power is going to come for data centers and the use of particularly natural gas versus, other sources and stuff like that. So like, how are you guys seeing that evolution kind of happening within your space around these credits and, you know, how these projects are being really sort of thought about and invested in and stuff? Is it for the AI demand because of this energy conversation we're having, or are you seeing a whole mix of different projects? So,
Well, um, we see that the growth because of AI is the number one driver of increasing power demand. And it's been a very interesting year post, and especially post OB3.
yeah.
So, kind of layering on the changes with the tax credit is also this, upward to the right graph of power needs in
Yeah.
the US. So that's the topic of conversation everywhere: renewable, non renewable energy. Where are we going to find all this energy? So the conversation is shifted a little bit because of AI growth and just the tremendous need for more power to support the AI workloads. is looking at kind of fastest to market. So it is demand side infrastructure. So we're seeing a lot more behind the meter projects. And there's some really there's a ton of interesting projects, creativity, innovation that are happening. And it is now a little bit more best of above in terms of we don't have the luxury if we're going to meet the demand, the power demand, we need to really look at all forms of energy and how we can bring more power to market faster than being there's a near term solution which is fastest to market, and then there's kind of a north star. We want to be have lower carbon intensity with our transportation fuels, with our grid. And so there's near term solutions and then there's longer term solutions. But the kind of the underlying theme is it has to be these we have to bring on more power as quickly as we can, and we need to look at all forms of energy.
Yeah.
And so we see a lot more discussion around geothermal and how geothermal projects can help nuclear, modular nuclear.
Mm.
And so I think the overarching kind of theme is that it's less about it being solar and wind and battery storage, and it's being very inclusive to look at all forms of energy to solve this issue, which is we need a lot more power and we need it online as quickly as we can. And then it's often behind the meter versus if it takes longer to do a utility scale project to increase the capacity of the overall grid. It's faster if we think about behind the meter projects that support a spot load requirement, like a
Mm.
data center, right? So it is a demand side infrastructure build out. And then certain markets, like Texas has done a really good job of this, where the behind the meter projects have to be built such that if the grid ends up being at their limit on capacity, that these behind the meter projects can essentially flip a switch and support the grid, right? So and it just kind of speaks to the creativity of the solutions that we're
Yeah.
seeing kind of to solve this issue now of rising demand at a faster pace than traditional energy development can keep up with.
Yeah. That's really, I mean, it's really cool to hear about some of that innovation around that because obviously it was a number, I can't remember exactly when it was, but it was a number of years ago that the Texas grid really struggled when
Right.
freeze happened, and it was like 2021 or something. And it caused a lot of problems. So, like, hearing again how these solutions are being created, not just because we need the additional power, but also then how do we, have reliable infrastructure, at all times is really cool. So, like, yeah, it's a really cool thing to see. So, I'm curious, like, I want to pivot. You mentioned fuels quickly, so I want to pivot to that as we continue walking through. So, like, the 45Z credit on the fuel space, is that something you guys are also seeing a lot of interest in, as well?
Yes, it is. It's a new credit.
Mhm.
It was also introduced with the Inflation Reduction Act in 22, but 25 this year is the first year that the credit is legal.
Okay.
And so we are working on a number of transactions with the 45Z credit. And it's a very attractive credit because it is a production tax credit. So it doesn't have the same recapture risk to the buyer as a ITC does. So the investment tax credits typically come with a 5-year recapture that the IRS can look at the transaction, look at the amounts, and potentially, say that there's an issue and those credits could be recaptured. But production tax credits don't come with recapture risk. And so the 45Z, there was also the 45X credit that was introduced with the IRA. And there's a lot of, from a buyer's perspective, a lot of similarities between Z and X.
Okay.
X is a manufacturing credit. It was meant to spur domestic production of components here in the US. Z is a cleaner fuel production tax credit. So for some industries like ethanol, it is based on a calculation of the amount of fuel they're generating that's going to transportation fuels, and then the emissions rate of that fuel.
Okay.
So the purpose of the credit is that the government would like to see our transportation fuels um, have a lower emissions rate. And there's some states that have the LCFS. They already have regulation, right? That the fuels maybe have to be blended. They have emissions requirements for fuels. Not all the states do, but some do.
Yeah.
And so the producers of fuels, cleaner fuels, can generate this 45Z tax credit because the emissions rate of their fuel is lower than
Yeah.
and so it's calculations based on production, and then it's based on the emissions rate. And so the starting qualifier is 50. And so that is it. I just recently read this. I found this very interesting that 50 came from basically 50% less than uh, fuel that comes from oil and gas operations. That's where that is the starting point to qualify for the credit, is that this cleaner transportation fuel is going to generate half the emissions that an equivalent gallon of traditional transportation fuel from oil and
Diesel.
gas
Mhm.
operations
Yeah.
would generate. Yeah.
So much to unpack for folks, because this is a space I've been looking at quite a lot, and working. One of the companies I work with is in this space as well, in terms of thinking about transportation fuels. So like lots of questions. So like you'd mentioned the LCFS, so the low carbon fuel standard, California, and I think is it Washington and Oregon now that have sort
Yeah.
of expanded it as well. But like,
Yeah.
can companies, if a refiner is creating biofuels, so they're creating biodiesel as well as maybe their normal diesel and stuff like that, and if they're selling that biodiesel into California, they can claim low carbon fuel standard credits in California. Can they also claim federal, or do they have to pick? Is it one or the other? Or
In that case, they have to pick.
mm,
Yeah. So it's the environmental benefit of the gallon of fuel is yeah, if they're getting the benefit of selling into the LCFS market, then they can't also claim the 45Z credit.
which makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm curious as well. And it was I did a podcast last week, and I recently put out a Substack post about the maritime conversation that's been happening, because that all got put on hold, unfortunately, where the International Maritime Organization didn't approve their essentially carbon intensity fuels program that they were going to be putting in place. Did you see a lot of demand in this space? Was sort of thought, you talked about with the hydrogen, the challenge was that there was no demand side for it. Was some of the demand side coming from things like the maritime sector? And like, are you expecting that to kind of have some implications for the demand around the 45Z credits? Or is there a different demand kind of center just because we use so much transportation fuels in the US anyway, right? Like, I'm curious, like, about how sort of some of that plays out.
We did see a number of projects being planned to, and the offtake was going to be for marine fuel. A lot of the 45Z credits are just being blended into traditional oil and gas pipelines.
Okay.
So a lot of the pipeline owners and existing, conventional energy pipelines do want to blend with fuels that have a lower carbon intensity. So I've really personally enjoyed like the waste to energy space.
Mhm.
And the great thing about those projects is they're very dispersed across the US. And there's always a pipeline carrying traditional natural gas or traditional energy in an area. And then the molecule coming from a waste to energy project is a lower carbon intensity, but it's almost a one for one molecule swap. So those projects blend very easy. And so most of the 45Z credits that we're seeing in the market are coming from fuel biofuel producers, cleaner transportation fuel producers, and they're just selling into the kind of the general market. But
Mhm.
we did see some projects being worked on specifically for the marine sector. But one of the challenges, and we see this with SAF as well, is that here in the US, farmers grow crops specifically for fuel production, and some places don't support that as a
Hmm.
cleaner fuel. So
Right.
the way we use land here in the US to farmers grow corn for the purpose of selling to produce ethanol. And there's some markets that don't support that thinking.
That makes sense. Because I think, yeah, for folks that aren't super familiar, like the feedstocks for renewable fuels and stuff like that, it can be things like corn and soy, but it can be things like used cooking oil and tallow and some of these waste products that you talk about on the liquid side. And then also things like methane gas and stuff on the gas side. And I think the thing that you pointed out there that I think is really important to highlight for folks is that given that gas is gas, whether it comes from a landfill or from oil and gas well, or again, like a liquid fuel, whether it's a biofuel or a traditional fuel, the fact that they can be blended and use existing infrastructure is so significant. One, in terms of capital, because you don't have to build new pipelines, but you talked about the challenges both on the CCUS CO2 side as well as the hydrogen side of trying to build new pipelines is exceptionally difficult. So it's
Oh, yeah.
in terms of decarbonizing our existing kind of activities, transportation is a huge piece of it. So I think it's a really exciting kind of space as well. So it's cool to see there's so much demand on that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a lot of buyer demand for the 45Z credit.
Yeah.
So, and one of the differences too is that some of the tax credits, the government has offered the monetization of the credit through a refund program called direct pay. So 45Q, a project developer can monetize their 45Q credits via direct pay, which is you ask the government with your tax return for a refund for the amount of the tax credits. So it's been very helpful in certain spaces, but 45Z direct pay is not available for 45Z. So the project developer only has two options. Either they can use the credits themselves against their own tax liability, and often they don't have enough of a tax
Mm.
liability to use the credits. They have to find a buyer.
Okay.
So
So
it's a little
people
bit
can
different.
actually transfer credits as well to other people.
Yes, yeah. So some credits can be transferred, and some credits can be monetized by direct pay, which is a refund, and you ask the government to refund you the money.
Yep.
But 45Z cannot be direct pay. So if they want to monetize the credits and not use them for their own against their own tax liability, they have to find a buyer for the credits.
Yeah. It's fascinating. We could probably do a whole nother half an hour about like the separation of like physical fuel versus credits and certificates and stuff. And there is a lot of analogy in that in terms of like the carbon credit kind of offset space where we see the same kind of thing of this separation of like emission reduction tokens, which is essentially what these certificates represent. But it's
Right.
a tax credit monetization, not an actual like carbon credit kind of monetization piece. Um, so cool. Dawn, this has been so wonderful. I'm just, as we kind of wrap up, I'm really curious, like, as you talked about how this year's been super dynamic already. What are what's on your radar? What are you looking out for? Like, what are the things that, as we start heading into 2026, yeah, what are you looking for?
Mhm. Well, I used to have a t-shirt when we were waiting for 45Z guidance after the IRA introduced the credit, but we waited a long time for guidance. I used to have a t-shirt that said waiting on guidance. And I feel like I need to put that back on because now we need fiat guidance. So the foreign entity of concern, that's so I think the two kind of main asks is more regulatory certainty. There's been a lot of changes this year with tariff landscape, which changes the price of goods, which changes financial models of projects. And then not just the changes to the tax credits, but the frequency of change is really hard um, for business to deal with and plan around. So we're hopeful that the rate of change will slow down, and so the framework around the cost of goods and how to monetize, the types of tax credits, how to monetize the tax credits. So a little bit more certainty in our framework, and then waiting on the fiat guidance. So fiat was a change that was introduced with the One Big Beautiful Bill, and so we're working on a lot of transactions and investments that have fiat considerations, and we don't have the guidance on what that framework will really be like. So it creates a lot of complexity in the investments, and so that would be my hope for 2026.
Yeah. Well, Dawn, this has been an absolute pleasure. I know I've learned a lot. So thank you so much for your time, and it's always great to catch up.
Thanks for having me, Deb. I'll talk to you later.